I told you we were going to do something a little bit different. Um, we're going to look at a little bit of geography with the Bible. I think who here has read any of the Lord of the Rings series, the books, The Hobbit, or any of that? No. How about seen the movies? You seen the movies? Okay, we got a couple of hands. All right. The reason I bring that up is because the Bible's not a very descriptive text, especially Genesis. Moses was very straight and to the point with a lot of what he wrote. And so we don't get a lot of the big picture of what's taking place during the first 5 books of the Bible. It's very down to the point, and it doesn't get into a lot of detail. For people who have read books like The Lord of the Rings, there's a lot of detail and a lot of world building that goes into that because they're trying to build this world that is different, that you're introduced into. But even for the people who do read the books, a lot of times, our minds are kind of confined to how we see it in our own head. And I think we do that all with the Bible as well. When we're reading the Bible, we tend to have a picture of what we think things look like or what things may have looked like in those stories. And so when we had the movies for The Lord of the Rings come out in, was it 2002, 2003, somewhere around there, people were blown away by it because for a lot of people who had read the books, they didn't imagine it being such a big, expansive world the way that Peter Jackson kind of directed this movie to be. So a lot of the concepts that they had for places in the book, he really blew up and made these big, beautiful, elaborate sets. And it was just very epic, and the scale of it kind of blew a lot of people away. So that's what we're going to kind of look at today with Abraham's journey. It's a very, very short text in the Bible that only takes 1 chapter of Genesis to go through, and it's not very detailed. There's not a lot in it. But it does tell us the places that he traveled and some of the things that they did, places that they went along the way. And so what we're going to do is we're going to kind of do a deep dive into that to flush out that picture and kind of give us a better picture of what that travel might have looked like. But we're going to start kind of back at the beginning in Genesis 1:1, because it's the first place that God mentions any kind of place in the Bible. And he tells us that in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Okay, so we've got 2 places right off the bat in the first sentence of the Bible that we are introduced to. So we've got the heavens, which is the sky and outer space, and the earth, which is the ground or the land. Now, I was going to go into a lot more detail about all of this, but as I started to get into the story of Abraham, I became a little more interested in fleshing that out. So we're going to kind of skip through. He goes over where Eden is located. The Garden of Eden, it says he planted in the east. There's a lot of debate about where this actually was, but we know that it mentions the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers as being 2 of the rivers that come out of the headwaters from the river that went through Eden. And so a lot of scholars kind of place it somewhere in Mesopotamia, right in between these 2 rivers, somewhere in here, roughly. And there are other historians, like Ken Ham, for instance. He says that he kind of doubts that was the actual location of the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers with regard to where they were mentioned in the Bible, because there is a lot of sediment built up at the bottom of those rivers that would have indicated that the flood kind of created those areas. So they may not have existed in the same place prior to the flood than they did after the flood, if that makes any sense. The face of the earth was kind of, I won't say erased, but when you have that much water covering the face of the earth, it tends to move things around and locations get shifted. But a lot of times what happens is, like after Noah got out of the ark and he saw these 2 rivers, he's like, oh, that's the Tigris and that's the Euphrates. Now, were they really in that spot? I don't know. So nobody really truly knows where the original location of the Garden of Eden was because of the flood, if that makes any sense. It kind of erased the footprint that we had to go off of. So, and this is Ken Ham's kind of defense of that. He said, the worldwide catastrophic flood of Noah's day would have destroyed the surface of the earth. If most of the sedimentary strata over the earth's surface, many thousands of feet thick in places, is the result of this global catastrophe, as creationists believe, then we would have no idea where the Garden of Eden was originally located. The earth's surface totally changed as a result of the flood. Not only this, but underneath the region where the present Tigris and Euphrates rivers are located, there exists hundreds of feet of sedimentary strata, a significant amount of which is fossiliferous. Such fossil-bearing strata had to be laid down at the time of the flood. Therefore, no one can logically suggest that the area where the present Tigris and Euphrates rivers are today is the location of the Garden of Eden. For the area is sitting on flood strata containing billions of dead things and fossils. The perfect Garden of Eden can't be sitting on billions of dead things before sin entered the world. So that's kind of his reasoning behind why he feels that we don't truly know where the location of the Garden of Eden was. Now, it does say when God kicked Adam and Eve out that he kind of set a cherubim out with a flaming sword. Obviously, I don't think we've run across that anywhere in the natural world. So, did that erasing of it after the flood mean that God then, said, hey, we don't need to guard it anymore because it's not there anymore? I don't know. But that's just his thinking on the subject. All right, so let's see. So we'll move on after the flood in Genesis 10. We're introduced to some more locations, beginning with Nimrod. So Nimrod established the cities of Babel, Erech, Akkad, and Calneh, which the Bible says were in the land of Shinar, which archaeologists place in southern Mesopotamia or modern-day Iraq, which is right in here. Many scholars believe that Shinar is a mistranslation of the Akkadian word Shumar, which means country of two rivers. So we'll be talking about the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. In verse 11, in chapter 10, we read that the land went forth, that out of the land went forth Asher and built Nineveh and the city of Rehoboth and Calah, and Resen between Nineveh and Calah. So if we look up here, does it show it on here? Yeah, Nineveh. So Nineveh, Asher. So he's saying Cain and his kind, they kind of moved up into this region. They built these cities around Nineveh. Nineveh was an Assyrian city, which was founded by Ashur, from which we get the Assyrians, founded in about 6000 BC. And it survived until it was destroyed by the Medes and Babylonians in 612 BC. So it was there for a long time. Now, its ruins sit near modern-day Mosul in Iraq. So you can still visit there today on the banks of the Tigris River. So in verse 19, we read about Canaan, who, of course, will become important in the story of Israel and the story of Abraham as well. The border of the Canaanites, it says, was from Sidon as you come to Gerar, from Gaza unto Sodom and Gomorrah, Admon, Zeboim, even unto Lasha. I mean, where are these places? So this is all in this region here called Canaan, which as we now know is Israel. And so he's saying, it was between Gaza and where Sodom and Gomorrah were here in the Dead Sea, and the north and south from, what did he say it was, Admon, Zeboim, even to Lasha. So if you can find those on your map, it's just basically outlining this section, which we call the Fertile Crescent, kind of down in here. All right. So we know Shem, it says, went on to settle in an area from Mesha to Sephar, which is in the Arabian Peninsula. So he was down in this area here. And that becomes important later on because that's where the Israelites would wander through the wilderness. Okay, so now we get to the story of Abraham. This is where it really gets interesting. So we're told in Genesis 11 and verse 28 that Abram was living with his father Terah in Ur of the Chaldeans. So Ur is right here on our map. That's where he was living at the time. And it says that Ur was the capital city of the Chaldeans, and at the time it had a population of roughly 100,000 people. Now, we might be like, wow, that seems like a lot of people for back then. But bear in mind, this was, over the course of a long period of time between Adam and Abraham. So there were a lot of people living in that area. So clearly this was still one of the kind of cradles of civilization. So when Noah came down off the ark and they began to spread out, they kind of stayed within this region. I mean, it's a fertile region. You got 2 rivers flowing right through there. So plenty of irrigation, lots of places to grow, lots of trade up and down the river. So people were kind of living in this region, and they just kind of congregated there. So I'm going to reference very heavily a paper from a biblical historian named Malachi Martin. He's an expert in the subject, and he wrote an excellent expose on Abraham's journey. So I'm going to reference several times some of his writings on this. So as we begin to unpack Genesis 12, Malachi Martin writes that Ur was the capital city of more than 100,000 inhabitants, a place of beauty, graced with towers, palaces, temples, law courts, market squares, statues, shrines, gardens, mosaics, friezes, reliefs, and monuments. It was divided into rectangular blocks by paved streets lined with 2-story houses. It had its own seaport and a man-made canal giving access to the Persian Gulf and the Indian Ocean, right down here. Ur was, in fact, part of an empire ruled by a written code of law drawn up by King Hammurabi. The civic order and public glory of that empire, Babylonia, were legendary. So in Genesis 11 and verse 31, we read that Terah took his son Abram and his grandson Lot, the son of Haran, and his daughter-in-law Sarai, his son Abram's wife, and they went out with them from Ur the Chaldeans to go to the land of Canaan. And they came to Haran, and they dwelt there. Now, when we think of Abraham, we don't typically think of him as a traveler, right? In fact, this short passage in Genesis makes it seem like his travel was just a short hop. Okay, they left Ur and they went to Canaan, or Haran and Canaan. That doesn't sound like much. Again, Moses was not very descriptive when he wrote these first 5 books of the Bible. So he's just pointing out the facts. They left one place, they went to another. Now, what does that entail, though? From Ur to Haran, Ur is here, Haran is here, is roughly a 600-mile journey. So, one sentence, they left Ur and they went to Haran, 600 miles later, on foot, no less. Now, this portion of the journey takes place before God speaks to Abram in Genesis 12 and tells him to leave that place. So this was just Terah taking his family out of Ur and going to Haran. So I'm going to read a little bit from Malachi Martin's writings on this because the way he fleshes it out, I think, is really fascinating. He writes, "And so one fine day, when the winter rains were almost over, they packed all their goods and cattle onto a few dozen 4-wheeled carts drawn by oxen. They liquidated their merchandise, or most of it probably, and converted it into chits of value and exchange made of baked clay. All along their route, they could obtain funds and food for every material necessity with those chits. We, in our unpeaceful world, are apt to imagine all sorts of danger that Terah and Abraham must have faced. Bands of roving robbers, murderous cave dwellers, ravenous wild beasts. What's hard for us to understand is the reality, the remarkable security in which they actually made the trek. In fact, they traveled every inch along the way by established trade routes, complete with milestones, armed patrols, river fords, guardhouses, food depots, and secure cities. The only serious enemies they might face were disease and the dreaded dust storm, the Idya, that came every spring and summer from the western desert, bearing a fine powder that blocked the eyes, nostril, ears, and mouth, ultimately choking the unprotected." So this route that he took here along the Euphrates River was a very well-traveled route during that time. So there were a lot of places for them to stop. There were a lot of milestones. There was a lot of guards protecting that route from raiders and things like that. So it was actually a very well-protected route that came along this way. And he was talking about the winds that would come up out of the desert in the springtime were really the only thing that they had to worry about aside from disease. It says, when he left Ur then and traveled up through the territory in modern Iraq, Abraham set out upon a royal highway through an area governed by civil law, bristling with trade and communications, inhabited by populations who enjoyed music and painting and sculpture and a written language of plays, poems, epics, songs, and novels. And as he passed slowly on the road northward, at the sufferance and under the protection of great imperial authorities, he was carrying destiny away with him in his very person, as surely as he was carrying his worldly possessions in his ox-drawn carts. As long as the caravan was on the first leg of its journey north over what is called Mesopotamia, the travelers never lost sight of the works of man. Apart from cities, they could always see at least one of the most visible objects in that land, the ziggurats. Each ziggurat soared skyward from a gigantic broad-based pedestal of brick and asphalt, rising sometimes to hundreds of feet, and always topped with a shrine to a god upon its pinnacle. Traveling through what we know as the Iraqi provinces of Muntafiq, Diwania, Hilla, Baghdad, and Mosul, Abraham passed at least 35 of these monuments gleaming in the sun on either side of his route. Today, only squat piles of ruins are to be seen. So their first important stop after leaving Ur was Babylon, right about here. Abraham would have known it as Bab-ilu, the most renowned of ancient royal cities. Its site lies just north of the town of Hilla in southern Iraq. Rectangular in shape, it was protected then by moated walls with 9 gates. It was bisected by the great river Euphrates, and it had 8 urban and 7 suburban districts whose paved streets were everywhere enlivened with many colored friezes and reliefs and lined with palaces, temples, and luxurious houses. Abraham and Terah led the way through the Latamu suburb, and, as all northbound travelers did, they entered central Babylon through the Urash gate. They went up Nabu Street, turned east at the Temple of Ninurta, then north by the main street and past the sacred area of Esagila, where the royal palace stood. There, 2 extraordinary buildings loomed. The Temple of Marduk, with its frightening gold-sheathed winged statues of that god, and the Eteme Anki, house of the foundations of the heavens and earth, ziggurat, which rose to a height of 296 feet. That's pretty tall. All of Abraham's descendants down to our day would remember it as the Tower of Babel. So, if you'll remember, it was in Babylon that they began to build the Tower of Babel. So the base of that was still there. It wasn't finished, but it was still there when Abraham went through. So interesting to think about. Most of Abraham's Babylon lies buried today beneath a deep bed of silt, some of it beneath the water table. Of the original ziggurat, only one small island of worn bricks surrounded by a moat remains. But you can still see enough to imagine the glory, and a smaller scale reconstruction stands nearby. You will marvel even today at the remains of the huge fortifications, the skillful use the Babylonians made of water channels to enclose the city, the still awe-inspiring remains of temples and palaces and statuary. Even the piles of rubble mixed with sand and broken mud bricks set the imagination whirring. After Babylon, there would have been nothing remarkable for many weeks of travel. So after they leave here, he's got several weeks of travel heading up towards Haran. Let's see. It was not until they reached Ashur that they saw some other extraordinary city. Ashur on the bank of the Tigris was as holy in the eyes of the Akkadian, Assyrian, and Babylonian people of Abraham's day as Rome, Mecca, and Jerusalem are for modern Catholics, Muslims, and Jews. Abraham would have entered the city by the Gurguri Gate, I'm going to butcher a lot of these names, and ridden over paved streets through rich bazaars, past glorious temples, and the huge royal palace. So he's essentially saying these, we tend to think of the time period back then as people weren't that advanced in their civilization, but this is actually a period of time in which civilization was thriving. I mean, they actually had a lot of the things that, we look back at, like modern Rome had. They had aqueducts and channels for water and irrigation and stuff like that, just like the Romans did. They had paved roads. Rome was famous for paving their roads throughout their empire. So a lot of that period of the Romans really extended as far back as this time when Abraham was traveling through these places. Let's see. So within another 4 or 5 weeks, by overnighting at such minor cities as I'm going to try to pronounce that one, and Nimrod, Abraham's family would have arrived at the most northern reaches of today's Iraq and entered the city of Nineveh on the east bank of the Tigris, which is right up here. Travelers along the trade route that followed the Fertile Crescent, as surely as a river flows its course, had to pass through Nineveh to replenish their supplies of food, water, and medicines, because the next leg of the journey was the hardest. It was inevitable, therefore, that Nineveh grew later to be a capital of the Assyrian Empire, a place so large that the prophet Jonah reckoned 3 days to cross it. Today, it's a site. The site is near the small town of, that's got a lot of consonants all crammed together, Kuyunjik? I don't know. And even though most of the old city is now mounds of dust and sand with some remaining brickwork and soaring walls, the restoration of the original gate with its fearful winged garden deity instills an immediate sense of the whole's original greatness. Now, from Nineveh, Abraham's little band at last took a westward turn, this way, for a trek of 200 miles. Along this stretch, the vegetation was thinner, the water scarcer, and the road bleaker and rougher and less well protected. 60 miles along the way, the route left what we call Iraq, passing into Turkey. There was only one adequate resting point, the city of Gozan, modern Tel el-Halaf in Turkey before Haran. Gozan covered 150 acres, was guarded by high mud brick walls on 3 sides and by the river Khabur on the 4th. You can walk around the city limits today, noting the remains of houses and streets and the remnants of a once beautiful building that rested on pillars fashioned in the shapes of divinities mounted on lions. So he kind of goes on to explain some of this area that they stayed. But they eventually make their way over to Haran in Padan Aram. And it was at Haran that old Terah died at the age of 205, which seems like a lot to us, but you have to remember his descendants. Adam, lived almost 900 years, so the lifespans were getting a little bit shorter and a little bit shorter, but he died at the age of 205. The family mourned him and buried him there, and tradition tells us the caravan spent the winter there. But as soon as the monsoon rains were finished early in the new year, it was to Abraham that God spoke, "Now get thee out of this country into a land that I will show thee." Now, I don't know how he knows what tradition tells about Abraham at that point in time. Maybe he's referring to some of Josephus's works. I don't know, some other secular historians possibly. But we don't really know how long Abram stayed in Haran before God spoke to him and said, "I want you to get out of Haran and go into Canaan, which I'm going to give you as a possession." The Bible doesn't really tell us. It just kind of goes straight from Terah's death in Haran to Abram being told to get up and leave and go. So in Genesis 12, God implores Abram to leave Haran and continue on to the land he's going to show him. And he gathers up his people, and they head west again. Now, I'm going to skip over some of the smaller stops they would have made for brevity. But eventually, they'll make their way to Damascus, which is right here. So they kind of pass through this area as they head south, and they come to Damascus. Now, Damascus is a name that you're going to hear a lot throughout the Bible. It's referenced multiple times in prophecy and also in the book of Acts, which is where Paul was on his way to persecute Christians when Jesus Christ met him on the road. He was on his way to Damascus. So just an interesting thing. Abram and his caravan would have stayed in Damascus for some time, even wintering there. The old city where Abraham tarried lies south of the Barada River. Its center, containing citadel and palace and temple, was on the escarpment overlooking the river. Take some time to walk along Souk al-Tawila, the long bazaar, until you come to the street called Darb al-Mustaqim, or Straight Street. Beneath the stones your feet tread lies an older street, one with the same name. Abraham walked that more ancient street called Straight Street. It existed in his time, where centuries later his fiery descendant, Paul of Tarsus, was cured of his blindness. So if you remember that story, Paul's told to go into Damascus, and there was going to be someone who would meet him there. And it was actually Ananias, I believe, who was called by God to go meet him, and he was staying on Straight Street in Damascus at that time. So really interesting how these locations pop up over time. Yes? Yes. I believe it meant something like a container or bag of blood, which is a real weird thing. I don't know why. I didn't actually look into why they named it that, but yeah, kind of a bizarre name for it. But let's see. So from there, he would have continued on south into the plains of Shechem, which is over here in Canaan. Now, Canaan at that time corresponded very closely to the present boundaries of Israel and the territories it controlled. So the land was about 50 miles at its broadest points and stretched almost 120 miles north and south, from the Wheel of Galilee's mountains to the bag of sand, the Sinai, down in this area here. It was at Shechem that Abraham first stopped, and he made of it the most venerated shrine of his race. He built an altar, his first, but far from his last, in that land. So from Haran to Canaan, from here down to where he stayed in Canaan, was about, from Haran to Canaan was anywhere from 400 to 600 miles. So you're factoring about 600 miles from Ur to Haran, from Haran down to here, about another 400. It's about 1,000-ish miles on foot. So, like I said, we're given very few details in Genesis about these distances and things like that. So I think it's really good for us to go back and get a scale and to say, wow, this is really quite some trek. I mean, it would make for an epic film, just the journey of Abraham. Like going from Ur all the way up into Haran and then down through Damascus and all these amazing places that he would have seen along the way. So we know that in Genesis 12 and verse 10, it says that Abram traveled into Egypt during the time of famine. So not only did he come all the way down here, but then they were having a time of famine. It says that he traveled down into Egypt. So that'd be another couple hundred miles down into Egypt and back up. So over the course of his life, he did a lot of walking and a lot of traveling. In total, the estimate's somewhere around 1,500 miles that he traveled on foot. Possibly more, depending on how winding the paths were going through some of these desert passes and things. We also know that he surveyed the whole land of Canaan at the time. So, he may have been traveling all about this region from one side of it to another, just surveying it throughout his time living there. And it says that he does at some point make camp in one area. Also then, when Lot was taken captive, it says that he pursued him as far north of Damascus. So again, left Canaan, went up north of Damascus to free Lot, and then bring him back. So another couple hundred miles, possibly. All right, when Isaac is finally born, we see Abraham's now very old at this point. Remember, he was like 100 years old, I think, when Isaac was born. So at this point, Isaac is old enough to take a wife, and he says, I don't want him taking a wife from among the Canaanites where we live. I want him to have a wife from Ur, from where my people are from. Now, he's not going to go. He's had his time traveling. He's done this before. He's been there. He's gotten the t-shirt. He doesn't want to go back. So he says, I'm going to call my oldest, most trusted servant, and you're going to go in my stead. And you're going to go back there, and you're going to take a wife for him from among my father's family, from my people here in Ur. Now, you put yourself in that guy's shoes. He came with them. his oldest servant. So you know his servant was with him when they left Ur. He's like, you want me to go back there? You realize it's like 1,500 miles, right? It took us like, I don't know, 2-3 years maybe to walk that. And he's got to go all the way from here back, probably along the same routes, because that was really the only route to travel. You wouldn't want to cross this. Why? It's desert, no water. I mean, that's just death waiting to happen right there. So the only options you really had were to follow this route all the way back north, all the way back down the river Euphrates to Ur. So you can imagine him taking this journey back, being like, I really hope I find somebody there. What if I find this lady and she doesn't want to leave? Should I bring your son back here? And Abraham says, no. He says, this is the land that we're to inherit, so you're going to bring her back with you. I mean, the pressure on this servant must have been immense. And you see that when he gets there, he prays to God when he gets there and he says, God, please, please let me find someone. And let it be this woman, when she comes to feed or to water the camels, that she'll offer to water mine and everything. So God answers his prayer. And, the first woman that comes down is Rebecca. And she does exactly what he asked God for. But you can imagine he must have had plenty of time to ask God along this route as he's going, this year-long trek or however long it takes him to get there. Please help me find this woman. So he finally does, and they're delighted with the offer. They want to have Rebecca go with him. And so Rebecca, this young woman, goes with a servant, not knowing who she's getting married to, realizing she's going to have to take this trip as well. That's another 1,500 miles back. I mean, that servant, I don't know who he was, but he did probably 4,500 miles on foot going out of Ur in the first place, and then back to Ur, and then back to Canaan with Rebecca. That's a long travel. So that was kind of the point of this lesson, was just to really look at this from a perspective that maybe we haven't looked at it from before. Because when we read the Bible, it's just very point to point. We read these place names and it means nothing to us. A lot of us, we might look at the back of our Bible and see these beautiful maps that they have printed out, but we don't really take the time to stop and think about what it would have been like. And especially at that period of time, not all of us are historians, and we don't know, what civilization looked like at that point. So I think it's really nice when we have someone who can flesh that out for us and really give us this kind of, epic picture of what it would have actually been like for Abraham, having made this journey on foot at that point in time. So I think that's kind of all that I have for us tonight. But I do want to open up the questions. If anybody has any questions or comments or just want to chime in, feel free. Okay, all right. Well, I guess I covered everything then. So we went through that a little bit quicker than I was expecting to, but I mean, is this something that you guys want to do a little bit more of? We kind of go into a little bit more detail and depth and flesh out some of these stories so that we can kind of get a better idea in our heads, at least when we're imagining, as we're reading through these texts. It's hard for us to really imagine and put ourselves in that place and say, this is what this would have been like for them. But if that's something that you guys want to do, I think we can do some more of this, or you can see a lot of. Yeah. Exactly. And that was the picture that I always had in my mind when it says, well, he left Ur and went to Haran. I'm like, okay, so he went a town over? I don't know. I never really actually took the time to look at a map and say, okay, well, how far is that exactly? And what would it have been like traveling that? Was it an easy travel? Was it difficult? How long did it take? Was it a day? Was it 2 days? Was it a week? Was it a year? You don't really know until you really kind of dig into it. So I think it helps for me, at least, to kind of bring the Bible to life a little bit more and to more fully understand. And as we read more about Abram, the sacrifice that he really made in leaving his family here, I mean, it's one thing maybe to go to Haran because that's his family still was kind of in control of a lot of this area. But Canaan, the families of Canaan kind of moved down to that area. They weren't really related to him at all. He said, I don't want you to take a wife from the Canaanites. I want you to have a wife from my people, from my family. So they must have been doing some pretty bad stuff down there at that time. Anyway, we know that Sodom and Gomorrah were there, and we know what happened with Sodom and Gomorrah and how evil and wicked and vile they were. So it's kind of natural. Abram was like, I don't want you taking a wife from this area. This is the wrong side of the tracks. We want you taking somebody from back where we're from, good old South. So, not one of them Yankees, Well, yeah, they would take, figs, dates, raisins, things like that they could preserve in cakes, and they would kind of, put them in a cake and wrap them up with, palm leaves and things like that. I imagine they probably smoked meat and stuff like that as well. But again, this was a well-established trade route. I'm not saying there were McDonald's along the way, but there were certainly stops where they could trade with other people and be like, hey, we've got these what they call them chits, the little Mesopotamian clay parcels that were kind of like our coins, and they could purchase food along the route as well. And he was pretty well off. Yeah. Well, and according to Malachi Martin, and I don't know, I'm not a historian, I don't know what they actually had in terms of technology back then, but he seems to believe that they had at least four-wheeled carts. So they could have had carts hooked up to oxen, and they could have put all their possessions, their food, their supplies, and things like that on these carts. Imagine kind of like the Oregon Trail a little bit. So, yeah. Well, I don't know if they were paved roads. I don't think that, long paved roads really came into existence until the Roman Empire. But it does say that the cities had paved roads within them. Now, how far out from beyond the edges of the cities they paved their roads? Probably not very far. I imagine a lot of it was just hard-packed clay or, dirt that they just ran over and over and over until it was a well-established path. So, yeah. Good insight. It would be, yeah. Yeah, I think when Tisha and I drove from Washington State back here, it was about 3,000 miles. So it would have been the equivalent of just about driving all the way there and back again. Yeah. And let me tell you, when you got a toddler in the back seat, that's a long way to go. It took us 5 days, but we had, trucks and everything, and it wasn't that bad, but I can't imagine making that trip over the course of months. I imagine it had to have been several months, at the very least. So. We were, yeah. Yeah, we can travel that now because we have interstates and highways, and we can do 60 miles an hour, sometimes 70, depending. But yeah, they would have been on foot, traveling really slow, and I mean, walking pace is what, 5-6 miles an hour. I mean, not very far. So. Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. All right. Well, we'll see you all back here next week, God willing, and the snow doesn't bury us all on Saturday. I think Steve already kind of made an announcement, but we'll kind of keep an eye on what the weather does this Saturday, and we'll make a determination on whether or not we're going to have church on Sunday. If we don't, I'll probably, at least put up a devotional or message or something on Facebook, just to keep up with people. So. Yeah. 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 Nope. We want you all to stay safe and stay warm. And, if anybody needs anything, don't hesitate to reach out. We'll be happy to help you out. So, all right. We'll go ahead and close in prayer then. Heavenly Father, we thank you for the chance that you've given us to take a little bit deeper look at your word, to really flesh out these stories that we read about in Genesis and understand that this is your word that you breathed into being, and these words were inspired by you, Father, and we're thankful that we have people who are willing to do the research and to really flesh out these stories to give us a bigger, deeper picture thousands of years later, Father, because these are stories that we're reading about that happened multiple thousands of years ago. And so it's a real blessing to be able to gather together here in the safety and security and the peace of this church, and be able to think about all these activities and the things that happened back in that time period. So, Father, we give thanks to you. Lord, we ask for your protection over everybody as they head home tonight. We ask, Lord, that you would keep the power on for everyone over this weekend and help us all to stay warm. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.